The disappearance of DeOrr Kunz Jr. in 2015 has baffled the nation. The purpose of this video is to offer an explanation for what seems to have been the vanishing of a boy into thin air from a remote camping ground. The day in question was July 10th. The camping ground was located in Lemhi County, outside the small town of DeOrr, in the state of Idaho. The 4 adults that are generally accepted to have been at the campsite are Jessica Mitchell, Vernal Kunz, Bob Walton, and Isaac Rainwand. A camping trip was quickly planned to apparently celebrate the fact that Jessica had been employed for 6 months as Walton's caretaker. The decision to include Isaac on the trip is very important to what we believe was the real motive for this last-minute trip. The group left Idaho Falls and arrived in Lemhi County around dusk, at approximately 9 p.m. Camp was set up and all 5 campers would allegedly go to bed without incident. All 5 awoke and began the day around camp, again, allegedly without incident. In the afternoon, Mitchell, Vernal, and young DeOrr made a trip into town to allegedly get gasoline and other supplies. At approximately 2 p.m., the group of 3 returned to the camping ground. According to Isaac, while he was showing Mitchell and Vernal possible fishing holes, located several hundred feet from the site, young DeOrr was left with Walton at the main camping ground. During several minutes of confusion regarding who was actually watching him, young DeOrr disappeared. We believe that attempting to establish the specifics as to where DeOrr was when he was left alone is actually not very important. We believe that there was never any real confusion regarding who was watching young DeOrr. We theorize that this was simply a cover story to create a plausible scenario in which none of the involved adults could be held accountable for the young boy going missing. After 20 minutes to an hour after young DeOrr allegedly vanished, Mitchell placed a 911 call. Vernal drove away from the campsite to make sure his cell phone had service, and also made a 911 call. The search for young DeOrr went on for days. Cadaver dogs were used, but DeOrr was nowhere to be found. The parents were of course questioned, and there seemed to have been attempts to steer suspicion towards Isaac. Isaac is considered to have been most consistent in his recounting of the events leading up to DeOrr going missing. Most commentators have concluded that DeOrr Kunz Jr. is dead. But where is the body? Obviously, this is the central question in the case. But consider the question in a more practical way. After taking into account all of the evidence, True Crime Oracle has taken what will no doubt be another contentious position. We believe that DeOrr Kunz Jr. is actually still alive. Isaac Rainwand would have every reason to be as accurate as he could be on the last time he physically saw the 2-year-old child. If DeOrr was not even on the trip, as some have speculated, Isaac would have every reason to point this out. But Isaac is adamant that he saw DeOrr after they returned from the trip into DeOrr. The trip into DeOrr was most likely for the purpose of a preliminary meeting with whoever the boy was going to be transferred to. We theorize that it was probably an older couple. We will refer to this hypothetical couple as Couple X. Couple X probably wanted to see Dior first, before they committed to the transfer. The exact nature of the transfer is hard to pinpoint. The best case scenario is that young Dior was given, in good faith, to a party with good intentions. Perhaps, to live a simple, but wholesome life, on an isolated farm. The worst case scenario would entail Dior being transferred to child traffickers. Although it would be easy to think the worst of Jessica Mitchell and Lemhi Kunz, here is what we theorize happened. The relatively long-distance camping trip was planned because they were actually meeting Couple X at some kind of halfway point. The direction that the group traveled took them northwest toward the Montana state line. According to our scenario, this might suggest that Couple X would have possibly traveled south, or southeast, from Montana state, or possibly as far north as Canada. The connection to Couple X was probably through Walton. Walton possibly knew the couple from the past, and was able to discreetly set up the transfer. If Vernal was involved, then the trip to achieve better cell phone service for the 911 call could have been to actually make the final transfer to Couple X. But if this was the case, then Dior must have been hidden from Isaac during the time period that Dior was apparently missing, but before the 911 calls. This would be an unnecessary risk. Couple X could have driven up close to the group's campsite, and then the transfer was done while Isaac was hundreds of feet away and out of view. It seems that Walton directed Isaac to show the fishing holes. This was probably part of the plan to create a chance for the transfer. As mentioned before, Mitchell was acting as caretaker for Walton, and presumably saw him nearly every day, for 6 months. We theorize that Walton and Mitchell probably planned the camping trip together, again, with the purpose of creating a plausible scenario whereby young Dior could be reported missing. The search was fairly large and comprehensive. The remoteness of the camping ground would limit the extent of ongoing searches. An annual search does take place, organized by the Lemhi County Sheriff's Department. We believe that the logistics for successfully disposing of Dior's dead body, and all evidence of foul play, would have been extremely difficult given the time frame of events. Where could the guilty party have successfully hid the body, in the time frame that is generally accepted? Really consider the implications that the body was never found, in light of the search that took place. We believe that the great weakness to our theory is motive. What is the reason for this elaborate plan? If Dior was unwanted by just one of the parents, this could start to create a motive for the deception. If Dior was unwanted by both parents, then why not give the child up for adoption? Why make yourselves murder suspects, and take on the public scrutiny that follows? We believe that Mitchell and Walton are almost certainly involved in the deception. We believe that Isaac is almost certainly not involved. Isaac was clearly invited, as some kind of patsy. No, not that kind of patsy. Isaac was invited by Walton to create reasonable doubt in the other adults. Imagine if everything happened as it did, but Isaac was not with the group. The parents, and Walton, would have been at least detained for interrogation. Isaac is evidently on the low end of the intelligence spectrum. For people who possess an IQ below 85, deception becomes an almost too abstract exercise. We are not saying that Isaac cannot lie. But imagine if the film character Forrest Gump was chosen as the full person on the camping trip. It is hard to imagine Forrest Gump lying to police. The only person who is on the fence regarding involvement in the deception is Lemhi Counz. We believe that the trip to achieve better cell phone service had another purpose. This was to disrupt the tire tracks that couple X would have possibly left behind during the transfer at the camping site. Could an unknowing Vernal have been directed by Mitchell to drive out of the campsite and cover the other tire tracks? This is possible. But this trip for better cell service is suspicious. As we can understand from the Ramsey case, when one of the parents is innocent, the deception is more believable. To answer the motive question, we believe that at least Mitchell was tired of her life with Vernal and Dior. She conspired with her grandfather, and the plan to transfer young Dior to couple X was created. Mitchell was not ruthless enough to actually murder young Dior, so she decided to use her grandfather's connection to couple X and illegally transfer the child. The reason for the deception was probably because Mitchell did not want the stigma of giving her child away. In rural communities, to give up on your child could result in ostracism. If Mitchell's extended family actually cared for Dior, this would also be motive for the deception. Apparently, Mitchell and Kunz's life was very unstable. Unpaid bills and an abandoned apartment point to a scenario where a desperate Mitchell just decided to give up. Walton would pass away in 2019. If Vernal was not involved, then at this point, only Mitchell has knowledge of the deception. Although the parents were eventually named as suspects, they were never formally charged with the murder of young Dior. The absence of a body makes the murder charge difficult. We believe that if Mitchell was actually charged with the murder, she would have probably revealed the deception to avoid jail. The bottom line is that this case essentially seems to have been some kind of planned abduction. We believe that while the search was occurring, young Dior was traveling back to wherever couple X had come from. Again, it is reasonable to conclude that young Dior is dead. But the fact that the body was never found, along with any evidence of foul play, is hard to square with a murder scenario. Isaac served as a patsy, but also as a witness to confirm that young Dior was in fact at the campground. To limit communication, the conspiring parties probably planned to meet in Ledor at a given time on July 10th. After the meeting in town, couple X probably trailed Mitchell and Vernal back to the campsite to await the right time for the transfer. The involvement of Vernal is obviously more likely if the preliminary meeting with couple X took place. We believe that the aged photo on the missing poster looks nothing like what young Dior would look like. Dior was young enough, at the time of the transfer, to have forgotten his true origins. It is probable that there are more of these illegal adoptions that take place, more than one might think.